pixie. Don't sound one for I'm the Sura no mamekwe. Don't sound one for I'm the powers it could up with say.
I wa papers makoroka akili yara. I wa papers makoroka ere yara.
Never found come da for your leg.
Favorites,
Come be pizza good food.
favorites,
So you can't talk of
favorites,
Senekela you can't talk of
favorites,
Favorite nana o kakuma de musoluma. Favorite nana ka musolu yiriwa. Favorite wame na konka kwad bapanga. Favorite wame na chinka kwad bapixi.
There we go. And welcome to today's webinar on storytelling and climate change. We're just giving people a couple minutes to join. Before we begin, I'd like to note that today's webinar will be broadcast in both English and French using live translation. In order to access the interpretation, please look to the bottom of your screen and click on the button that says interpretation. It should look like a small globe, and please choose your language of choice. If you are joining by mobile phone, please click the three buttons on the right of your screen, click more, and choose your language where it says language interpretation. So I'm choosing my language and I'm switching back and forth. So hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on storytelling and climate change, a case study in climate change adaptation strategies organized by Farm Radio International. Today, we will be talking more about our methods and why we talk so frequently about communication in our work. And one last time, if you're just joining, we'll be broadcasting this webinar in both French and English using simultaneous translation. And in order to pick a language, please follow the instructions on the screen. The event should take us about an hour with a question and answer section at the end. And we would invite you to submit questions for us throughout the webinar. And we'll have some of our staff answering questions, or we'll ask them live at the end. You can do this either in the chat, feel free to use it, or by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're also recording today's webinar, so you'll be able to find it in the future on our YouTube page. And with that, I think we can get going. So I am delighted to be your host today. My name is Tara Spreckerhoff, and I edit and produce Farm Radio's podcast, Nature Answers, Rural Stories from a Changing Planet. In it, we share stories of rural communities in sub-Saharan Africa who are using nature-based solutions to adapt to climate change. Well, the aim of that podcast is to inform and educate people outside of sub-Saharan Africa about the really interesting stories of climate change adaptation that are coming from these communities. What you hear in Nature Answers is really only a small element of the work Farm Radio International does in storytelling. So, who are we? Many of you are probably familiar with our work. So Farm Radio International is a originally Canadian-based international non-governmental organization that is uniquely focused on improving the lives of rural Africans through through the world's most accessible communications tool, radio, in combination with other information and communication technologies like mobile phones. So we work in partnership with hundreds of stations across 38 sub-Saharan African countries, where we implement projects at scale, as well as outside of those projects, we provide resources to radio stations themselves so that they have the resources to improve their own programming. We also have a digital innovation team that looks at how we can use phones, interactive voice response systems, social media, and other forms of communication to ensure that our projects and programs are participatory, interactive, up to date, and that they're not just about the dissemination of information. So we often think of ourselves as a communication for development organization. So what that means is that we leverage the power of media to do our work. That is to say, we use media to increase knowledge, and we use communication to increase knowledge, to change behavior, and to facilitate widespread change at scale. So today, we will be specifically talking about our On Air for Gender Inclusive Nature-Based Solutions project. And this project is a 5-year project funded by Global Affairs Canada that seeks to raise awareness and promote community action when it comes to nature-based solutions. So a quick note here that nature-based solutions, which you might hear referred to as NBS in short, are defined by the IUCN, or the International Union of Conservation of Agriculture, as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, and that simultaneously provide human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So, as part of this project, we're working directly in Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Uganda, and Zambia with a few goals. These are enhancing the enabling environment for rural community action on climate change adaptation, increasing awareness about nature-based solutions in sub-Saharan Africa, that we want to see increased responsiveness by national, regional, and international decision makers, really the expressed needs, wisdom, and experience of rural communities, particularly women and youth, in adapting to climate change and using gender-inclusive nature-based solutions. And finally, increased Canadian engagement in the use of nature-based solutions themselves. So we'll dig into those a little bit more, as you'll see, but we do much of this using the power of story and storytelling. So what does that look like in our project? Over the 5-year cycle of the project, we run, over the 5 years of the project, rather, we run several cycles of programming. These start with on-air dialogue, where we use radio programs and mobile phone polling to gauge public opinion and to pull stories from communities. We want to see what people know and what the current action on climate change is. And those polls lead to policy and dialogue events with decision makers, where we tell the stories gathered from local communities and advocate for the solutions sought by those communities. Then we move into what we call high impact radio programs. This is where storytelling really comes in, and we use our documentary plus radio format, which you'll hear about in just a few seconds, to tell more stories about climate change and encourage communities who are implementing nature-based solutions and showcase those communities. And from those programs, we also derive podcast stories for Canadian audiences. And then finally, we get to widespread awareness, where we take those stories and turn them into resources that radio programs in 20 plus countries can use. And we evaluate that. But without further ado, We'll get into a little bit more about those storytelling programs. And so let me introduce Amidou Cabaret. I'll just change languages here.
Amidou is radiocraft training at FRI, is based in Burkina Faso. He is journalist, and so he joined FRI since 2020, but he has a vocational experience in the domain of information and communication. Hi, and welcome, Amidou. Amidou is here to speak about the approaches we are using for storytelling. So, Amidou, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot, Tara. Hi, everyone. Thanks for giving me the floor. I would like to highlight the importance of local stories and also the training of broadcasters and how we are doing some series of programs. Let's start with the importance of local stories. Why are we choosing to tell local stories? And these are real stories and they are interesting too. We know that facing climate change, people and communities have difficulties that they want to solve. First of all, with the local stories, what we need to know about them, it's because that they allow to address the problems and challenges. Sometimes we ask ourselves if community members can explain their experience facing the challenges they have. And also, we want to know if they are able to identify and explain these challenges themselves. For example, with the rural exodus and its consequences, this is a challenge for rural communities. Then, we may have a solution or a local action. In this regard, we can see it is also important for community members or a group of the community to be able to explain the nature-based solutions found to solve the problem or challenges mentioned above. For example, we know that composting was a nature-based solutions used to slow down rural exodus. Then we have the results of the action undertaken. One or more community members present concrete results obtained at a specific stage, and they can also share how these results are benefiting everyone and how. The next highlight I would like to share with you, next slide please. This is related to the training of radio broadcasters. Why is it important for us to train the radio broadcaster? Because this is relevant for us to be able to touch millions of people. We should say that each region has its particularities and possibilities and challenges. Based on the nature-based solutions which are applied, the stories are different. I will share an example with you. In Burkina Faso, we have 3 regions where the project is implemented. In one of these regions, we have a man who is practicing composting. And in another region, a woman is also doing the same. We also have a cooperative of men who are practicing beekeeping. All this is important because stories from other communities are ways to inspire others to reflect on their own climate risks, including, for example, flooding, droughts, heat waves, soil degradation, and even new illnesses. At the same time, the same communities can keep reflecting on the solutions they can adopt and how they can go about them. Next slide, please. We can also ask ourselves why we want to work with broadcasters. Let's say that radio broadcasters are influential members in their communities. These communities trust them because they think that they are able to provide reliable information. Another element which explains our choice of the broadcaster is that they are doing a great job by undertaking surveys, so that through these surveys, they can ensure high participations of these communities in their programs. If we want to move on regarding the programs we are producing as part of this project, we will talk about the documentary plus series. What we need to know, next slide please, we have 3 parts with this series. We have a documentary per se, we have a discussion part, and we can add the way things are going on through this documentary plus series approach. So the documentary plus series is a series of radio episodes based on real stories. These are stories from real people who work and help their communities to find solutions to their problems. For the documentary plus, we have 4 main steps, including the fact that we need to understand the problem and the nature-based solution. The second step is related to the discussion about the results and the possible obstacles. For the third step, we have a public decision regarding the adoption of a nature-based solution. And to end, we have the implementation part based on the technical solution process. In this regard, with the implementation part, we can try to duplicate at scale. Next slide, please. We can also ask ourselves why at FRY we decide to choose and use documentary. So by presenting real stories, we are able to demonstrate that in sharing these reliable information brought forward by community members, people will believe in these stories and they will be able to adapt the presented nature-based solution. This is an important element for us to have people who can adopt the nature-based solution. In addition to being informed, people will try the practice. They will try to do something to change and start to do something concretely speaking. In this way, we will say that people will start to apply the solution. And this is why we can say that radio is an information tool that can lead to action. This is a powerful tool. For the next part, so for the documentary aspect, we will move on to the discussion side. So When people know a problem and they are able to find a solution, all these will lead them to have discussion with some specialists to make sure that the solution adopted is very effective. So how do we go with this discussion side? First of all, you need to identify a story. And this identification of the story will lead you to make a storyboard for the documentary. After all these steps, you will have to conduct interviews with the heroes and other actors based on the meeting's setup. All this will allow you to understand more the problem and the solutions which is about to be addressed in the documentary. Next, after the interviews, you will have to collect sound effects which will be necessary to tell the story. After doing the collection of all of these sound effects, you will have to edit the interviews, and obviously you will have to write the script and record intros. And these audios will include intros and extras. We will have also short introductions and short conclusion. And finally, we'll go with the mixing of the interviews and the sound effects. This is, briefly speaking, what we can say about the documentary plus approach. To conclude, I would like to share a short clip of an episode so that you can see how we have been able to edit the sound effects and every parts of the environment. So a first character said, the material used for compost consists of wheelbarrows, shovels, pickaxes, water canning. The primary material could be composed of millet or maize stalks, nut shells, rice bran, grasses, forage. All these materials can be used to make compost. Animal dungs, cow pots, and food crops can also be part of this composition. And for the second character, this is the main character, is asking all producers to invest in composting to make it an activity like the others. And is adding that composting improves our yields, protects our cultivable land against the effect of climate change, and composting is a solution against rural exodus and the flight of our working population towards gold mines. So you will hear sound of pickaxes in the manure pit. If you wanted, I will invite you to listen to the short clip. Thank you.
Abaraka mina kern kome brouette, pelle, pegasi ani arrosoir an kain ko soro sisan femi u kain ka dilan ni ɲɔ kala bi se ka dilan kaba kala bi se ka dilan bin bi se ka dilan tigɛ ɲaga bi se ka dilan ka fara ani soso ɲaga ale tigɛ fara mi am to ka singa kisɛ bɔaran ale fana bi se ka dilan misibo fana kain ka fara kan alo to ka dumuni kɛ ka dumuni morson bi ɲagami bo min nan ale bɛɛ bi se ka fara kan ka dilan
kuma min bɛ ne fɛ ka ɲɛsin sɛnɛkɛlaw ma farafin nɔgɔ dilanko ra n bɛ fɛ k'o bɛɛ ka wuli an k'an bolo don ɲɔgɔn bolo k'an cɛsiri ka farafin nɔgɔ nin baara yiriwa ka sabati ka kɛ jagoya fɛn ye pour que an ka se k'an yɛrɛ ka kɛnɛyako tanga ka dugumakolon faga cogo tanga k'an ka sɔrɔ buguya pour que an denw kana wuli sini ma sini kɛnɛ k'a fɔ k'o bɛ taa wari ɲini jamana kɔ kan dɛsɛ le b'an denw bilara boli la n bɛ fɛ k'o bɛɛ ka wuli an k'an bolo don ɲɔgɔn bolo k'an denw minɛ k'a kɛ an ta ye o ka se ka baara kɛ ala ni farafin nɔgɔ dilan kama.
Thanks a lot, Amidou. Do you have anything to add before we move on with the remaining part of the presentation? I just wanted to share with you the environment in which our characters are working and how we are going to look for information we share in the documentaries. Thanks for this nice example you shared with us.
Now I have the pleasure of introducing Esther Juliet Apio. Julie is a Ugandan radio personality with more than 10 years experience. She is currently a producer, an assistant programs manager, and a radio show host at the Voice of Teso radio station in Soroti, Uganda, where she is the co-host of Voice of Teso's, I'm not even going to try and pronounce this, Yoga Akwenyan show, and the producer of Farmer's Choice, which is a program sponsored by Farm Radio International targeting farmers and interesting them in the conversations around nature-based climate solutions. She took on this program in April of 2023. So welcome, Julie. Welcome to the conversation today. So,
thank you.
Amazing. So we're just going to have a short conversation about what it was like to be a broadcaster on these programs. But can you tell me about your initial reaction, the initial reaction that you had when you first heard that you'd be doing documentaries as part of your partnership with Farm Radio?
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Well, when I first heard about documentaries, I always perceived them to be difficult to make, maybe just really not interesting myself. Mostly, I've loved documentaries before, but video, I perceived them to be very difficult to make. Well, on the making end, that would be a different one. But as a listener, even, I think I mostly enjoyed video documentaries. Because then I would see and understand what I need to understand. I just wasn't sure how that was going to play out if it was audio or radio documentary. So I wasn't really excited at first. I was like, well, if it is what we're going to be doing, okay, let's see how.
Amazing. So as we've mentioned, Farm Radio will do trainings with broadcasters like yourself to teach them on the different methods of storytelling. So can you tell me what you learned from the documentary training?
Well, we learned techniques of making radio documentaries actually from scratch. I was really getting them for the first time, to be honest. I hadn't interested myself in them, but I learned the basics of really making a documentary, what you need to do about sound, about sound effects, about characters, about storytelling, really in-depth storytelling, and in a very interesting way. That is what we learned, and we actually had a chance to try out, just go out there, record documentaries, and review them, produce them, and review them along with a mentor. Yeah, I think that is basically what we did during that 1 week training on documentary making.
So how was this different from what you had been doing on your shows before?
Well, in my shows, we basically held live talk shows where we would invite a guest and we talk about whatever there is to talk. And when we are done with it, we will have some feedback coming through, yes, but we're not really sure how, how the community or listeners perceive the entire conversation. We just assume, okay, they've understood what we need them to understand. But in this case, we know the listeners felt an emotional connection to the story you're trying to tell them. We know how compelling it was to them when they listen to the story and, they want to be involved in the story. They feel actually involved in the story. We are taking them to a particular place. Well, the main difference, I would say, is in our normal broadcasting and what we've been doing before, we have been telling them what we want them to hear. But in this documentary format, we are showing them, basically, we are taking them to a place we want them to go with us. Like we are going with them to a place we want them to see. So that is like the biggest difference.
Yeah, that show don't tell element of storytelling. I'm going to break that rule a sec here. Can you please tell us about your first documentary? We're going to hear a bit of that in a second, but can you tell us what you did for that first documentary?
Well, my first documentary was about a farmer in a place called Morunga, Tunya sub-county in Teso, where farmers were trained to practice an NBS, or nature-based solution, called Farmer Managed Natural Regeneration, FMNR in short. So we went visiting and found out information, and it was an interesting story to tell, especially when it comes to environmental conservation and climate change. So we visited this man who had planted a lot of trees around his yard, and he had basically managed to transform his home into a mini forest. So in the entire village, if you looked around, maybe took a walk, it's his home that actually stands out with the number of trees he has planted, and it's just a very huge difference when you just enter. So the documentary that you're about to play is basically us getting there. Like, okay, this was a 3-part documentary, really. The first part is just us introducing the place where we are, me introducing the place where I am, and whatever the environment feels like around there. The second part goes a little bit deeper, and the third part also, just gives us some solutions that we managed to see from the ground. So in his 60s, and he has achieved a lot from planting trees, and his home is all green. Like I mentioned in the documentary, like his home is like a mini Mavira forest. You have a forest in Uganda called Mavira. It must be the biggest forest actually in the country so far. So I called it the mini Mavira forest around his home. That's what the documentary is about.
Lovely. Well, let's hear a clip from that documentary right now. So we'll just play that. And you can see the translation on the screen.
Adialo lengo Jalam sub-county, Lailo Murungatun, area munkele to general Noi, Alailo, Alex Ebalo, Lo Ebakasitung Ichebe, Subitore Kebala Bila, Naimuroni. Doteni eja vera cheda e muchidore sa wolio rida narai mambere ngato dotanyu nije rida esubiti bolibore balati kibira loko mabira forest dokere mamuji wani ni togara mamuji lo marti to mama goro adaponi kitolo e ujagalu helili bola ibo sidina biyai takwe katunga meribori kitwani ije mambere ngajeni kechekirore ada Mako leja kaite bala swamura la beat. Hey, you want to get kito isisi? Ngese bakareja nebe emea. Ara iwe senior. Dore senior la era ikito. Dawengo ka ikatimu alo munta malaro ke polon ebalo Alex. Idomo ngese masera jono keli sapa ara ikilioko. Mbojo kese mmojo ngitosi noida. Boete otole mlo igwa unitosi kito. Balati gagole lilimi.
So you can certainly hear the elements of storytelling in that. I'm intrigued and I'm excited to hear more. But what was the reaction from your audience, from your listeners, when you started playing these documentaries?
Well, they were as excited as I was, really listening to the whole story. And after putting it all together, it felt exciting. It felt like, I was taking somebody somewhere, and that is exactly what they felt like. Some people actually could almost think they know the place I'm talking about, and others were like what you're describing or whatever that story is about. I feel like my home actually must be better than that, because you have a trees, yes, but I think I also have trees. Like, okay, they just found themselves imagining they're at that place. I took them to that place and they felt excited that they knew the place, and also actually suggested their homes could actually even be much better than that home. So I received a lot of calls of people inviting me to go tell their stories. But obviously these things are planned, but many of them basically were so enthusiastic about these stories, and they're like, I really need you to tell my story as well. Please come this side and please come this side. I could just tell there was a lot of excitement in community.
So what have these documentaries meant for you as a journalist and as a reporter and a broadcaster?
Well, personally, I believe I have grown so much as a journalist, as a reporter as well, and as a producer as well. It's a plus on my side because I never really used to do this before. I was never at one point even looking forward to trying, but after trying, I feel like it has introduced me to a whole new world where I have met bigger opportunities to grow as a journalist in my career. It has given me another part of journalism to actually invest my skills in and my energy in. It is something I want to do over and over again. I feel I'm so passionate about it now. Ever since then, actually, I feel I grew this passion for storytelling, and it has also affected how I am doing things locally at my radio station. I have had a few meetings with the management to just talk about if we could introduce some documentaries or I feel like I want to put my time more into creating more documentaries. My mentor, Anissa Ilash, introduced me to a South African media house that helped me create one documentary for World Radio Day this year. And that is part of the growth that I actually celebrate ever since I learned how to make documentaries. And going forward, I'm still learning to do more documentaries. I'm still connecting with friends and the people in the media that like to do radio documentaries. And I'm looking out for all those opportunities to make sure that I do more of them because I find them so fulfilling, so exciting, and just very interesting to do.
I can hear the passion in your voice about this form of storytelling. Can you tell me, why is storytelling so important?
It is important because it helps us to send a message to the community, but also it helps the audience to really connect with the story you're trying to tell emotionally as well. It helps to generate the emotion you want, but also the call to action that you're trying to achieve. Like it helps to really connect you to your audience. Oftentimes when you just listen to a story, let's say a newscast, maybe you just listen and that is it, and you let it go. But when you're doing storytelling, documentary format, you're basically inviting somebody for more all the time. And these stories are more in-depth, they are more interesting to listen to. They provide deeper perspective, and I think every emotion captured in there helps to build the story and makes it more interesting to listen to.
Thank you so much, Julie. I feel like I could continue having this conversation for another 20 minutes and I wouldn't get bored. But I guess we have to move on. So thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned before, Julie is a radio host and a producer at the Voice of Teso in Uganda. So we've talked a bunch about the importance of storytelling and heard some anecdotes about its potential. But it kind of leaves us with the question, does this actually work when we talk about whether or not it can create change or do things like that? So next, I have Samuel Kojo Antobam, who is here to talk a little bit about the impact of these documentaries, just based off of our evaluations so far. So Samuel is the Regional Monitoring, Evaluation, Research, and Learning Coordinator for Farm Radio International. And he is based out of our office in Accra in Ghana. So Samuel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tara. Probably for the sake of connectivity, I will turn off my video. Thank you. Great. One statement that really caught me when Giri was just speaking was that she said that this time we are not telling them what they want to hear, but we are taking them where they want to be, where they need to be, especially when it comes to climate change adaptation issues. And I think by and large, these stories, these documentaries are by and large achieving that. Perhaps sometimes even to our own surprise in terms of the levels of achievement that we are already gathering so far. So in the next few slides, I'm going to show how we are using various methods, including case studies, household surveys, community surveys, um, diaries, policy tracking. All these are kind of approaches to show the kind of effects or sometimes even impacts that these stories are having in the communities that we are working with. So generally in the next few slides, I'm going to show how we are creating awareness, changing some perspectives, inspiring some actions in terms of NBS, and also how, even though in a very short period, we are contributing to some policy changes. Thank you. Next slide. Great. As in my introduction, I said sometimes even to the levels of our surprise. And one of the surprises that we are seeing so far in these stories is the fact that the listenership has been quite high. In fact, that slide is not shown here, but when you look at other countries, the three countries that we surveyed, Ghana, Uganda, and Burkina Faso, we are having average listenership over 70%, which is quite high. And sometimes even we are even surprised at that. When you extrapolate that, that is already giving us over 9 million audience in terms of these the approaches that we are using. That is quite high, and that is something maybe we may want to investigate later. But what I want to tell more here is the fact that the listeners themselves are saying that what they are hearing, the understanding is quite clear. They understand the story, they understand the objectives, they understand everything that the stories are trying to show. And also they are saying, all the countries, and most of them are saying that these are quite relevant issues that are related to them in their daily lives in their communities. So that is for me quite interesting to note. Next slide, please. And with this kind of appreciation, gives us some example of some awareness. And here we are showing awareness of some core benefit of MBS initiatives in terms of economic gains, conservation of medicinal plants, improve water quality, prevention of erosion. In all these countries, especially for Ghana and Burkina Faso, Ghana and Uganda, we have very high levels of awareness of some of these core benefits of MBS as a climate change adaptation way. And that is quite encouraging with that kind of high level of awareness. Thank you. Next slide, please. Also, apart from the household survey, we are also doing some other community surveys and some focus group discussions, and showing how those these stories are changing some perspectives. Generally, in all the countries, we are seeing that over 90% of the communities now agree that NBS can help reduce vulnerability in their community, and more so vulnerability among women and youth. When we come to the communities, we have an example from Uganda, where people in this community are saying that we are no longer cutting trees after listening to the programs, but we are actually planting more. We have another good example from Ghana in the next slide, please. Another good example from Ghana, that the second rectangle. And here, it's not just about initiation, but also because of what they are hearing, these stories, what they are hearing on the radios, there's an increase in participation of even already existing initiatives, as we have it here. It says initially participation was low due to lack of understanding. But as we continuously educated individuals on the benefits, more people joined. And that is quite interesting for me. Apart from various communities kind of changing their perspectives, we are also seeing some changes in perspective among some government agencies. In Ghana, we have an example here where in the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, where we are now, due to lessons that they have learned, they are now including NBS in all their programs for climate change adaptations. Thank you. Next slide, please. So with this awareness and knowing the benefits comes with initiation of some of the NBS and projects in various communities. In communities where we did random surveys, especially in Burkina Faso and Ghana, we see some appreciable number of communities taking up NBS initiatives in the last few months, say about 6 or 8 months that we started this our program in those communities. I must say that not all these are new initiatives, especially those in Burkina Faso, not all of them are new. Some were already existing, but due to our programming, they have included other aspects like gender inclusion, participatory discussions, and all those kind of things. So these are some of the kind of effects these radio programs, these documentaries are having. Initiation of new project and also improvement upon existing ones when it comes to using NBS as a climate change adaptation technique. The next slide, please. This probably might be my last one. We all know that when it comes to policy changes, it's a long-term goal, it's a long-term shot. And some of these changes may even happen outside the life of this project. But we are quite encouraged by some of the changes that we are having in terms of policies, in terms of some other programs that are taking place in these countries that we are having these programs. We have an example here from Uganda. It says, yes, we are reviewing the forest policy to change the target of forest coverage to 25%. So they already have some projects around it, but they are changing that policy so that they can increase that target to about 25%. And this is all somewhat getting this as part of our influence, our part of our project, as part of the stories that we are having in these various communities. Also in Ghana, they have this Green Lift program where they said this is because we engage with farm radio and also reach out to various agencies. And let me say agric agencies within the regions. So we have them on so that they can help us to implement this project. So by and large, as I said, when it comes to all the policies, things will take a bit of time. But we are happy and we are encouraged by the fact that organizations and agencies are already trying to increase those MVS in their projects, educating their members and doing all kinds of things to improve using MVS as an adaptation technique. Thank you very much. This is quite a short one, but we can always talk more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. And I think we're happy to field any questions that you might have, even by email after this event. So with all this said, there's definitely one last element to this that I think is important to acknowledge. So we know that storytelling alone can't work in a vacuum. And as many of us who think about climate change on a regular basis know, we know that individual or even community action alone won't help us climb out of this, climate change mess a little bit that we find ourselves in, which is where my last colleague comes in. So I'd like to welcome Serem Gebre to the floor. So Serem is Farm Radio's nature-based solutions specialist. She comes to us with experience in international trade, environmental economics, public policy in developing countries, corporate social responsibility, aid effectiveness, and extractive industries. And she has a background in working in environment and policy. So Sarem is based out of our Burkina Faso office. So welcome, Sarem, and over to you.
Thank you, Tara. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a good grasp of how and why storytelling can be powerful. And now let's talk about a bit about sustainability and how we can ensure that those powerful stories will have, a long-lasting impact and a sustainable impact. Next slide, please. So I want to focus on 4 main points here. So the first one is about the importance of creating an enabling environment. Next slide, please. So for the foundation for sustainable impact is the right enabling environment with a transparent and inclusive decision-making process at the policy and at community level. So several studies show that in terms of dealing with issues like climate change or biodiversity loss, the traditional top-down approach is not efficient enough. So it's important to adopt bottom-up approaches like community-based approaches in order to have the appropriate policy in place. So because inadequate policy will lead to unsustainable development and also to more inequality and more mismanagement of natural resources. Next slide, please. So what is the approach used by farm radio to influence decision-making process at the policy level? So we're using this radio programming approach called on-air dialogue. I think Tara mentioned this approach at the beginning. So this radio approach called on-air dialogue, next slide please, is an annual consultation that farm radio is having with rural communities to gather their needs, their experience, and their challenges on specific topics. So last year, as part of our nature-based solution project, we consulted rural communities in 6 focus countries, specifically on climate change and also biodiversity loss. So these 6 countries are Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Ethiopia, Uganda, and Zambia. So, so we consulted communities and we ask questions like, what are the impacts of biodiversity loss in your community? What are the changes made in your community to address the impacts of climate change? What is the main challenge in terms of community action to address climate change, to address biodiversity loss, etc.? So these kind of questions that we are asking communities. And as a result of these consultation, we actually recorded more than 20,000 interactions from these 6 countries. Next slide, please. So rural communities needs, aspirations. So the next objective is to create build bridges or to build bridges between policymakers and rural communities during our dialogue events. So we are organizing these annual events where we are presenting these OAD results to policymakers, to relevant stakeholders, whether it is public or private stakeholders, NGOs, civil society organizations, so that rural communities needs, challenges, and initiatives are taken into account and are heard, and policy makers are taking into account those aspirations, those local communities' voices in public strategies and investment and programs. And in these OAD programs, we are emphasizing on having the voices of women, youth, and other marginalized groups, so that their voices are heard, their needs are heard and taken into account, and that no one is left behind, and to have also these long-lasting impacts. Next slide, please. So what would be the policy implications from these on-air dialogues results? Next slide, please. So to give you an example of our on-air dialogues results, when we ask communities what is the best way to preserve and protect biodiversity, they usually answer by saying by protecting and restoring natural ecosystems like forests, like grasslands, coastal ecosystems, etc. So this means that rural communities do have the solution for addressing climate change, for addressing biodiversity loss. They usually have the answer, but they also have some needs that they expressed in those OADs, and these needs are in terms of support, in terms of community mobilization, but also in technical and financial support. Next slide, please. So because of these results of the OADs, as a policy recommendation, we need to have adaptation efforts that should be based on community-led processes, that should promote as well traditional leadership, and these are supposed to be supported and encouraged by local government services and local NGOs. So to share with you another success story from Zambia, according to our policy survey that we conducted this year, we asked policymakers and decision makers about the action that they're taking in terms of nature-based solution, in terms of investment or programs that they are implementing to support nature-based solutions at the community level. We found that in Zambia, the Ministry of Environment decided to train its staff on nature-based solution, but also to develop a guideline on nature-based solution. This is a huge policy results because if the ministry staff is well equipped in terms of nature-based solution, that means they can also take into account, and they can also support rural communities in the implementation and design of nature-based solutions. So next slide, please. So two key takeaways from my presentation, and perhaps for the global presentation of the webinar here. So we need to have the right policy that is inclusive and transparent decision-making processes in order to have a sustainable development and to ensure that those impacts and those powerful stories are long-lasting and they are sustainable. We also need to get the right enabling environment because it is the foundation for a sustainable future for local communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saram. So we have a chance to answer some of your questions, but we are at the top of the hour. So it's 12 o'clock, at least where I am. And so if you have to go, please know that we will be sending out a recording of this webinar. But I'm going to pose a couple of the questions that we have in the chat to a couple of our colleagues, maybe probably over the next 5 minutes. And then we'll wrap up fully. Feel free to depart if your journey takes you elsewhere at the moment, but you will get a recording after the fact. So some of your questions have been answered in the Q&A box already, but I'll just pull a couple of them. One just that came up for Samuel. So the question here is, are the changes in behaviors that you observed, such as the number of communities that have taken on NBS or nature-based solutions initiatives, only due to the radio programs? Or were there other activities implemented in parallel? And this is a question, Charles, as well, if you want to jump in on, feel free to.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that question. So as I said, some of those projects were already ongoing, but all that they did was to maybe improve it, make it more inclusive upon hearing our programming. I wouldn't say that almost all of this came up maybe solely due to our program. For example, if a community in Ghana, and this is a clear example, in Ghana, we had about 20 communities that told us that they started some tree planting exercises in the last 12 months or so. Now, can we say that it was mainly due to our program? I will say yes, because already during that period, we also know that the government gave some communities some seedlings. We also know that some NGOs are also helping with some of these initiatives. But the point we want to make here is that our programming has already done a lot of encouragement in these communities, changed some perspectives. So even the ones that are existing, people are even increasing participation of community members to mobilize themselves and to even make it a bit stronger in these communities. And at the end of the day, that's all we want. I mean, we cannot do everything ourselves, and it's always great having other stakeholders taking part to support this. And I think that's what was also shared by Sam. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I don't know if Chas wants to add something.
No, that's good, Sam. Thanks.
I'll move on to a question for Amidou from Florence. How are the individuals who are telling these stories identified?
So for the stories which are identified, these stories are first of all identified through the on-air dialogue. This is a series of programs, of interactive programs. And its specificity is with the surveys we are doing on the radio. These are live surveys, and the listeners are asked some questions. And after the surveys, we have the documentary pre-production. A staff from FRI goes to the community radio stations, and there they are inviting the radio broadcasters to go in the field to work with communities. In this regard, for the listeners which has been able to participate in the on-air dialogue, they are selected to share their stories. Also, we go to the government department to see if there are already some initiatives which are undertaken in the field. And with all their contribution, we are able to go to the members of the communities and the listeners we are selecting to ask them to share their stories, which will help us produce programs which will be aired at the level of the radio stations. So this is how we try to identify the people who are sharing their stories in the documentaries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amidou. In the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up this Q&A period. So I know, for example, Doug, there's a question that's a great question that we won't be able to get to today. But I want to thank everyone who had these questions. Please feel free to send us any questions you might have after the fact. We would love to answer them, and I apologize that we ran out of time to answer all of your questions. But to wrap up, I just want to say some final points. So first, storytelling is key and essential when encouraging people to make choices. It helps them relate and see themselves and the people that we're showcasing. These stories help explain the key challenges people are experiencing, define those challenges, and propose a solution in a relatable and entertaining way. In short, a way that people will listen and react to. But they need to be included with other things that we're working on, how-to guides, things like policy change, so that they can make change in an environment that is sympathetic to that change. But storytelling is in our nature, I think, as human beings. And as I said, it can't do the job alone. It needs to be supported by discussion and guides and an enabling environment. And so let's not have this be the end of this conversation, but rather the opening of a door to more stories that we can tell. Today, and wrap up, I'd like to say thank you to all of our speakers and presenters, Amidou Cabra, Juliet, Samuel Antobom, and Surem Gebre. I'd also like to thank our translator, who's done a great job today, Sarah Karambi, and those who helped us behind the scenes, Charles Ta, Eleanor Wilner-Fraser, and David Addo. If you have any questions or any further questions that we weren't able to get to, please don't hesitate to reach out to us by email. We have one email, info@farmradio.org, for any general questions. Or if you yourself would like to see how to include storytelling in your own projects, in your own work, please don't hesitate to contact us at partnerships@farmradio.org. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you have a good end of your week and a good rest of your month. So thank you so much.
Aye wa favors makoro ka akili yara. Aye wa favors makoro ka ere yara.
Liba fa kom da fo yelle.
Favors.
Kom bibi sa guda fo.
Favors.